Our next speaker is Sergei Petrov, and as you know, he's going to talk about sculpture and photography. Who takes the shots? Sergei. And Sergei, you can have a little more time, because Christopher was so greedy in the time that he took. That we'll allow you 2 minutes more.
I take your instructions as a gospel, so I think I'll fit in 15 minutes. But thank you for suggesting this topic, and Jeffrey, again, thank you for having me here. And it's about not just sculpture and photography, it's about photographing sculpture and photographing art in general. It's a subject that we all take for granted, especially now, because reproducing art became such a commonplace, but I think there would be a few points that we need to address. See, my photographic career began in 1977 after I left a position as a scientist and researcher in the Soviet defense industry for a job as an art publishing house. The transition was easy. With my background in science and technology, mastering photographic techniques and equipment didn't take much time. Within a few months, I was photographing paintings and sculpture in major Russian museums, such as Hermitage in St. Petersburg and Tretyakov Gallery in Moscow. I think in my career, I photographed several thousands of paintings and maybe hundreds of different pieces of sculpture. However, it took me much longer to fully appreciate the great irony that in order to successfully photograph a sculpture, one has to accept the fact that the project will inevitably end up in a failure. No matter how sophisticated, a flat two-dimensional image could not possibly fully represent the complexity of a three-dimensional object in real space. In other words, when photographing sculpture, the success can be defined only in terms of lesser degree of failure. With that limitation in mind, we shall discuss the subject of sculpture and photography. While the question of whether photography by itself is an art form is still being debated, the utilitarian side of it has been obvious from the very beginning. The excitement of having discovered a fast technological process to capture images without tedious hours of copy drawing led to a widespread adoption of photography in cataloging and popularizing art. The photographic apparatus quickly became the universal recorder and led to a common notion that the camera never lies. Only recently, with advancement in neuroscience and better understanding of how human brain perceives three-dimensional world, can we fully realize that not only camera lies, but it does it with a vengeance. By providing an abundance of details in a photographic image, it fools our brain into thinking that we are looking at real objects in real space, while the object size, shape, and relationship with the surroundings may be at best left undefined or at worst completely distorted. Modern photography gives us incredibly powerful tools to capture, edit, and enhance images. However, when such power is left unchecked, it makes photography a medium of illusions rather than a faithful recorder of reality. While most applications of photography, from family shots to travel, nature, advertising, actually benefit from such augmented reality, for reproduction of sculpture, it spells a disaster. Masterpieces of grace and elegance can easily turn into crude, tasteless objects. Yet mediocre, boring pieces may end up looking vibrant and full of energy. To better understand the nature of the problem and the ways to mitigate it, we need to consider what actually happens when we use a camera and lens to capture an image and how it's different from our human perception. When seeking clarity on this particular issue, I personally find it's useful to think of an object as having three different types of form: physical, visual, and perceived. Today, three-dimensional scanning already allows us to map any three-dimensional object with incredible detail and accuracy. It's not far-fetched to imagine that soon we'll be able to do such mapping at macroscopic or even molecular level. Such data represents an object's physical form. It may enable us to create exact replicas of the object, but as human beings, we cannot process it directly. Knowing the physical form is an equivalent to having an object in a dark storage room. We know we have it, but we cannot form any opinion about its aesthetic qualities. Visual form is created by the interaction of physical form and light that illuminates the object. It comprises all the light reflected by the objects in all directions. Hypothetically speaking, if we surround an object with a sphere that is capable of recording this light and then releasing it, an outside observer will never be able to tell the difference between the real object and its visual form played back. It is natural for us to think that we see with our eyes, but actually what our mind looks at is a simulation constructed by our brain in a highly complex process of integration of various sources of information, not all of them visual. This integration happens on a subconscious level. Some of it happens in our retina, and most of the time leaves us blissfully unaware of its intricacy. It's a continuous process of sensing and integration. As we move our eyes from one part of object to another, walk around it, look at the surroundings, we actively interact with visual form, explore it in greater and greater detail. Yet all these numerous different views are being seamlessly combined in a single perceived form of an object in our mind. A photographic camera, on the other hand, is capable of recording only the tiniest portion of visual form at instant of a time. The lens makes a linear projection of a three-dimensional object on a two-dimensional flat surface. Most of the information is lost. The back is not visible, sides are distorted, and even the front loses a lot of its spatial characteristics. Taking multiple photographs of the same object doesn't help. Our brain cannot integrate a collection of separately presented images into a single mental form. It continues to perceive them for what they are, distinct objects in space when we are looking at a set of photographic prints. A person with a trained visualization skills perhaps can build a mental image of an object based on a set of different photographic views. However, it's mostly conscious effort, and the result lacks the intimacy and the immediacy of direct interaction of our senses with the visual form. Although such mental reconstruction may serve a purpose in a technical design or engineering, it's useless when it comes to viewing and experiencing art. So when we look at the photograph of a sculpture, our brain's capability to create the perceived form is severely limited by the lack of visual input. Instead of a novel, we get a half-page abstract. Instead of a movie, we get a 1-minute preview. This is a fundamental problem which can never be fully resolved. However, there is a partial remedy to it. Being able to recognize the distinct objects in a three-dimensional space that we live in has been crucial for our survival as species. Our visual apparatus has evolved with multiple levels of redundancy. When stereoscopic vision of two eyes is unavailable, or when we cannot move and change the point of view, our brain falls back entirely on using other characteristics of available visual information, such as shading, perspective, coloring, and many others to render in our mind the three-dimensional perceived shape of an object. Our brain's ability to process these secondary sources into spatial information allows us to look at two-dimensional image and perceive three-dimensional forms and shapes. It is possible to take a photograph of a sculpture in such a way that when a person looks at this image, the mind creates the perceived form similar to a degree to what it would have created if looking at the original directly. This is not an easy task. It requires understanding of the mechanisms of human perception in great detail and mastering the associated photographic techniques. For me, studying the history of art and observing how different painters created perception of space and form in their work has been a crucial source of this vital knowledge and skill. However, until recently, while still working with film and chemicals, a photographer was very limited in applying such knowledge in practice. The arrival of digital photography and digital editing tools, in particular, has removed practically all technical difficulties as well as the element of a chance in image taking. Yet, such freedom came with a price. Today, a novice photographer is easily overwhelmed by numerous possibilities that became available and can no longer hide behind the narrow aesthetics of a particular photographic technique. But even a skilled photographer, who can now be very precise in achieving the desired objectives, faces a daunting task of deciding what should be done with an image, instead of what used to be a much simpler question, what can be done. In a strange way, the advancement of digital technology made photography less technological and brought it more in line with the traditional graphic arts, with the unavoidable dilemma of a blank canvas and what to do with it. What photography went through in the last decade was truly revolutionary, transformative change that brought many intended as well as unintended consequences. For a photographer of sculpture, it stressed more than ever before the need to have clear objectives and guidelines to prevent the photographer from starting to create new art instead of reproducing the original. In an ideal world, no one is in a better position to make a judgment call than the creator of the sculpture. But only few artists have successfully photographed their own work. A productive collaboration between the artist and the photographer, when the artist takes the role of a director and the photographer acts as a cameraman, is also very rare, for obvious reason. Most of the sculptures lived way before the photography had been created. Most of the time, the photographer has to act alone and derive any guidance only from the artwork itself. In my professional career as a sculpture photographer, I have developed several guidelines that I have been following. First, and most important, the photographer needs to abandon any artistic ego and artistic ambitions when photographing sculpture. Although it requires a lot of special skills and experience, this is not and should not be a creative process. The absolutely worst thing that the photographer can do is to impose a new artistic vision on someone else's original art. Second, the photographer should not try to capture the artistic essence of the original and then somehow express it in a different media. Even if successful, which is highly unlikely given the inherent limitation of the reproduction process, it would impose the photographer's personal interpretation and misrepresent the original work of art. What the photographer should do instead is try to collect in a single image as much of the visual form of the original sculpture as possible and express it in a flat media without distortion. The result would be far, far inferior to the original, but it would not be misleading. It is important for the reproduction to clearly show that it does not do justice to the original, even for those who have not seen it firsthand. In this short presentation, I have highlighted the inherent limitations of reproducing three-dimensional art in a two-dimensional flat media and the challenge they face the photographer of sculpture today. Which brings us to the central question: what is the actual purpose of reproducing art, and specifically sculpture? Is there another objective beyond the obvious one of cataloging and recording art for identification and authentication? Do we try to capture the essence of artwork regardless of the limitation, with the hope that at least some of it will survive the reproduction process so it can be shared with those who have not and might not have seen the original? Or do we limit the reproduction process to creating an image that, while clearly inferior to the original, nevertheless provides enough visual content to raise an interest and suggest that it's worth the effort to see and the experience original? I hope in this discussion that follows, we can address this and as well as other questions related to the photography and sculpture and art in general. Thank you.
Thanks, Sergei. Who would like to begin the discussion? Got a lot of people here who use photography in their work. And Mona?
It's always been a concern for me in teaching art history, especially to undergraduates, from rural parts of Canada, that their only exposure to a lot of the canonical work will be through the photograph, so that art history becomes slide history. And I'm just wondering if any other art history educators or other educators have any thoughts about how you get around that problem, other than encouraging them, giving them assignments that send them to galleries, to places like this where they can actually experience the work. Because otherwise, when Christopher was showing that Carl Andre piece, for example, there's a vast difference between your understanding of minimalism in looking at that photograph or in actually experiencing the work in situ. And I remember, Alistair, you talking about how your experience of the photograph versus your experience here in the sculpture park affected your interpretation of the piece as well. So I'm just interested to know if there other people have encountered that same difficulty in getting students past their own experiential limitations.
Well, maybe one of the students would like to answer that question. Natalie?
I think that there's no, I think the best thing, of course, is to go and see and to try to give, as you were speaking about yesterday, try to just give an impression of what a work is, so that you can later, or you can encourage the student to actually go and do it. I think there's also a lot of advantages in using the internet and projects like Art Project through Google Earth, getting students to experience the gallery itself, like where you do like a kind of a street view up to the artwork, and then you can zoom in and have a very high pixelated version of the actual piece of art. So at least you get the experience of what it would be like to walk through the Louvre or something like that. But of course, nothing can replace the actual experience.
Yes, Brad.
I went on Sergei's workshop yesterday, which was excellent. Thank you very much. We learned quite a lot. And he was showing how yesterday was a very bad day to photograph art. And he started out by saying, you have to accept it's a failure. And I'm wondering, especially for Jeffrey's work, which is in a sculpture park, and we've talked about counterpoint and the environment around being counterpoint, and yet a photograph is really just encapsulating the sculpture. So what is the extra difficulty, maybe this is a question for you, with photographing in a sculpture park? Because you can't capture this landscape.
Use your mic, Sergei.
Sorry. I don't think it's fair to say there is an extra difficulty, because the better is the art, the more aware I become how inferior the final result would be. So it's really just when I photograph great pieces of art, it always makes me humble. And photographing them in this setting, in this environment, you have to deal with so many unknowns that I think in this particular case, Jeffrey is in an excellent position, because he's there all the time. He can observe his sculpture at different lights and conditions. And after all, it's his judgment as the creator of this art is the most important. Also, the park, what I found here, is actually very easy to work with, because all the pieces are positioned very thoughtfully according to light, according to relations with other sculptures. In a previous, only a few times I photographed the sculpture outdoors in sculpture parks, and it was very difficult, because you can tell that there was not enough consideration went into how they would line up and what would be in the background. I would say, here actually photographing sculpture in its natural environment and having the landscape as a counterpoint, it's very easy, providing you have enough patience to wait for the right lighting conditions.
What are the ideal lighting conditions?
It depends on the material.
Sergei has hit the nail on the head here. It usually takes me 2 years before I'll photograph a piece. I walk the park every day, and so I go clockwise one day, and the next day I go counterclockwise. And when I've placed a piece, I look at it over and over and over again in all the different lights that I can see from a daily basis that are here. I know the ideal light for any given piece. Once I've made the decision to photograph, I wait for that light, and I stop everything else that I'm doing. I use a tripod, put the camera on a tripod and go out and start shooting. And it usually takes several shots over a long period of time to get that piece right. And when I say right, the sculptor's in a very, very difficult position because she wants to introduce the audience to the work, and that's all that it is. It's an introduction. So you want the right introduction at that particular point, and that's all that you can really expect to get out of it. The problem is, as Sergei pointed out, there's an infinite number of picture planes. So the most difficult thing, both in placing the piece and in photographing the piece, is having to choose an iconic view. That will be the iconic view in 2 dimensions of the piece, and it's the only way to make the introduction. You can't make the introduction to the piece without that icon, so that when someone has seen it on the internet or has seen it in a catalog, they can point to that piece and say, I recognize that piece. And that's pretty much probably what everybody is doing with sculpture in art classes. So in understanding that the best that you can do is introduce somebody to the piece, then what you have to hope, and this is where the artist comes in selecting the photographs for his work, or for my work, is that this, to me, is a welcoming introduction to the piece itself, so that when someone comes into the park, they can say, oh, I recognize that. The strangest thing just to hear is people say, I'm familiar with your work, when it's only been in photographs. That's a strange part. So I wouldn't say that you want people to be familiar with it, right? Or even claim to be familiar with it. It isn't that. It's that first introduction and handshake to the piece that says, I'd kind of like to look at that piece, or I'd kind of like to be there. So that's... Sergei, in the rest of this, I know we've talked about this. It's a really difficult thing. When shooting somebody else's work or in another environment, I just won't do it. And generally speaking, I don't let anybody else do it with my work I trust Sergei because I know he understands the problems. Is that it becomes far too easy to look at a detail of a piece, and because I know there's an infinite number of picture planes, and almost anyone can choose one that they like and present it as their own work. I've never liked the idea that work can be appropriated. I think that kills the whole idea of art and originality. And I know that people probably could write papers on why that's not true and why that shouldn't be true, but I still see it that way. And so it's very, very difficult to deal with isolating any parts of those pieces. And I know that in art history you're always going to have detail shots, and the detail shots usually are not very good as far as the piece is concerned. But then the biggest thing about photographing sculpture is that sculpture has presence. And now paintings have presence too, but for sculpture it's a rather total thing, the aspect of presence itself. So it's a problem. But I don't know. We'll see. You see photographs of the work. These are my photographs on the covers of the books. I hope that they're a welcome introduction to the work, right? Sorry.
On that note, would someone... Yes. Janet.
I just wanted to add to that about the question earlier about teaching and educating, and kind of having the idea that there are infinite planes to taking a photograph of sculpture. And I just wanted to add to that in terms of introducing people to listen to music, because there are also in some ways infinite interpretations of a musical work, and that even though you can listen to the same piece by different performers again and again, it will never be quite the same. So I think I'm just adding to your point about how it is an introduction to a piece of music or a piece of sculpture, because it will never be able to capture everything that you want to capture in a photograph or in one performance. So that's the same. It's a similar situation, I think, in other arts such as music.
That's interesting. Yes.
And I might add,
Jennifer.
I empathize with your problem, but imagine teaching theater history. There is no data, there is no document, I would love a photograph, I would love a poor photograph. There's nothing. So, yeah, it is a problem.
Yes. Marcus. I'm sorry, and then Alistair.
Just picking up on that issue of teaching, I mean, in my field, in Islamic art, there are most of the objects my students will never have the opportunity to see. And one can't convey, spatial qualities of architecture and sculpture and so on. But there is a kind of issue of materiality. And the thing is that bronze has different qualities to steel. They have intrinsic qualities and constraints that the artist has. And it's something which I've emphasized through physical handling sessions of objects and getting the objects I can. So I have steel objects, silver, bronze, brass, and so on, and as well as metalworks, as well as glass and ceramics, is having these handling sessions where you can get the tactile qualities of these things. And I find that's a very valuable teaching tool, in that it does at least give some insights into what sort of a thing it's going to be, what sort of physical properties is it going to have.
That's excellent.
That's very good.
Yeah.
Alistair.
This is a very rich conversation, and yet I'm not entirely happy with the direction in which it's going. Because it's rather Platonic. It implies that there is an absolute ideal of experience, and everything else is a kind of poor replica of it. And if we adopt that perspective, then we're all destined to fail, that whatever kind of reproduction we attempt, or replication of something, or a translation, which is another word we could use, we're going to end up with something which is not quite as good as the actual experience of the thing. And of course that's right. Who would prefer a photograph than actually being in front of the sculpture? We can all agree with that. Yet, I'm just trying to think of ways in which we can shift this around. Not so that we can say that the reproduction is preferable, but open it up so that we acknowledge that it's necessary. If you're a historian, you're always dealing with things that cannot ever be brought back, which are gone, which are past. And artworks stay in one place, which is very problematic if you lived somewhere else. And if you actually go there and have the experience, you only have one experience, and that's never total. And so I've come to see Jeffreys Park in May, and it will look very different in November, and that's something that I'm painfully aware of, and I've only seen it for a certain amount of time, and so on and so forth. So limitation is built into experience, and once we exceed that point, then I think we can maybe open up the conversation and think of productive ways.
I think you're right. I think my question, Karun, curator, JRSP, my question is, do you think that your perception of the work would be aided in seeing a photograph in a different season or in a different light? I think that Jeffrey is completely correct that from an artist's perspective, you're introducing the work. However, from my perspective, as someone who is introducing viewers, who have never seen sculpture before, or perhaps even scholars who've come once, the photos are very useful. Detail shots might not be at all interesting to the creator of the work, but they are interesting to other people. And I tend to think of photographs as abstractions and as ways to focus someone's attention on certain aspects. Our brains don't learn in totalities very well. They learn chunk by chunk, layer by layer, and so when you're presenting something to someone as an educator, you want to present them with one layer of reality and another layer and another layer. I love overwhelming people with the whole totality. They're going to apprehend it on a gut level. It's going to be there, but then when they go back home, it's great for them to be able to study it in a different season. The light, I've got lots of photos where the light is different. The piece looks completely different from different angles. I think that, to me, that's productive. Once you've seen the work, it's really productive because you remember it. And I go back to the photos a lot. I sit there and I, mask them and look at them, and we change the background. So I think of the photograph as a tool to aid understanding. I don't know that I think it's definitely better to have been here before because you like Sergei says, you have that picture of the cup in your mind. So now you're adding information, you're adding layers. But I think that sometimes the simplification is really good. We haven't talked a lot about internal counterpoint. We've talked about counterpoint in relation to the landscape, but the internal counterpoint is something that, with the background, is really difficult for people to grasp. Some people, so you bring another medium. You bring in the round. Row boat is something that I would bring in. But simplifying the background so that you can see the internal counterpoint for someone for whom counterpoint is really new, really important. Something you can do with a photograph. That being in front of the sculpture is quite overwhelming for some people. I've had PhD students in art history say that it took me a few times to recognize the visual counterpoint, where then it becomes this completely obvious thing, and you grow into it and you grow into it. So I would rather see the photograph as fundamentally an abstraction. I mean, it is an abstraction of a physical object on a two-dimensional plane, and I see it as a tool from my perspective. But I also respect that as the originator, you have a certain motivation and a certain need to present the work in its entire composition. It's probably painful for you to present 2 seconds or 2 minutes of your composition, and but it was an introduction for us, and we got a sense of it. So I think that both perspectives can live at the same time in our evaluation of the value of the photograph in the sculpture and in this kind of a setting. Thank you.
Can I pick up on what Karun has said there, that his phrase was, I think, the photograph is a tool for understanding, yes? And could I then ask Alistair what you think of Sergei's remark, which was almost in passing, saying that the photographer shouldn't aim to create a work of art? I think that was what you said, wasn't it?
I think that's a very important point. The photographer, the analogy that was running through my head as I was listening to you is somebody who's translating a piece of literature into another language. That you don't want the translator to become more important than the author's work. It is a subsidiary role that you're adopting, and there is a kind of established cultural position for that. It's not the same as an artist's status, but it's a very, very worthwhile activity, and it's very, very important, and we need them alongside our artists and originators. But it's at a different level, and recognizing that is extremely important.
Alistair, you're absolutely right. If I can just add, certainly in Canada, there are now big awards for editors, for translators. The whole infrastructure of writing that I've experienced has become so professionalized. And for instance, book I've got coming out, the editor who did nothing but destroy it, and usually I've had very, very good editors. She was dreadful. The publisher wants to put, this is a so-and-so book. And you're absolutely right. These people are commanding because they want to be creators themselves, and they don't understand. They're in the subsidiary role. So I welcome that comment. And we had a comment. Yes.
I was just curious, for those of you who are here for the first time, what the experience was like coming to the park versus the photographs that you saw. And like I know Karun and my father have been working really hard and have all these publications, but I'm just sort of curious what the disparity, or if you got a sense of the scale and the size and the scope of the park before you came.
Good question. So. Okay.
I'm not. Maybe my position's a little bit different because I've spent so much time as an artist, and before I was an artist, I was a student, and there's a story I like to tell. When I was a student, a lot of us were making very big, flat, colorful paintings of uniform scale, and it was in response to the slides that we were seeing. And we were all really surprised when we went to New York and saw that these things were actually all different sizes, and I think that's changed. But what's happened over time is we got better at reading. You develop a way of reading photographs, and so and you become well versed in reading the subtleties of the photograph. You can tell if the colors have been augmented or saturated, and we look at a lot of art online or in magazines, and so I'd have to say that although my reading of I got to see more of the work when I got here, of course, the works that I had seen in reproduction, I wasn't surprised when I saw them in real life, because I felt that I already had some relationship. And I think the analogy of having an introduction is a very good one. And when I document my own work, that's how I think. I think, how can I represent this the best, knowing that it's not going to match the color, knowing that it's not going to match the scale, knowing that they're not going to see the whole thing, but how can I, even in some ways, enhance things to make a photograph that's going to make people want to come and look at the work.
Good. Thanks, Paul.
Can I just respond quickly?
Yes, and then Sergei.
Sorry, Sergei. My name is Alan Brody. I'm a student in directing in the Department of Theater at UVic. Prior to becoming a graduate student, I've had a 25-year career as a lighting designer in the theater. And I've spent a lot of time over the years debating with my colleagues as to whether we are in fact artists at all. We are certainly in the service of other artists, playwrights and directors. So it's been very interesting listening to this, the entire 2 days. Light is, as a medium, is, as we discussed yesterday, the color of light is all relative. Light is, it's an ephemeral medium. It's a medium that, within the context of a theatrical production, exists over time. The properties of light that we manipulate have to do with intensity and color and contrast, and there's so many different factors at work. And where am I going with this?
Do you see yourself as an artist?
I do. But I'm an artist who works in the service of somebody else's vision. So I would not place myself in the first order of artists. And I say that
I'm sorry, I disagree. He's much too modest, everyone. He is a great artist in his own right as a lighting designer, one of the major lighting designers of the country.
Thank you, Jennifer.
Thanks, Jennifer.
But the medium that I work in is very, very difficult to capture outside of the moment of performance. The audience experiences the medium of light in time, in space, and then, like the performance, it's gone. And so I just wanted to add that is uniquely, an equally challenging, though not uniquely challenging, artistic medium to attempt to capture in another form. Jennifer and I were talking at our break about the department's assessment of an incoming graduate student in lighting design, and how the people appraising her application found it completely impossible to make any assessment of her ability as a lighting designer, because it is
From a photograph.
From a photograph, it's impossible to gauge whether this person standing before us, what their merit is as an artist who works in the medium of light. Anyway, I just wanted to add that.
No, thanks, Alan. And maybe Sergei could pick up on...
Yeah, I just would like to pick up on this and in response to
and maybe
Alistair.
and also to Lieba's question about use.
First question, when you made the comparison that photographing art is like translation, here I strongly disagree, because when you translate, it might be from one language to another, but both are languages, both have the same level of complexity. When you photograph sculpture, you go from three-dimensional object to a two-dimensional object. You go from real size to something which is used here. It's a fundamentally different media. So I would compare photography and sculpture as writing a half-page review of a book, which is okay if it's treated as an introduction. But what happens today with the advancement of digital printing and photography, etc., it's very easy to confuse the two. This little introduction, if it's not done carefully, becomes so real, so it overshadows the original piece. It creates an illusion that it's enough just to look at the picture. And from my experience, I became convinced you cannot tell a good painter from a bad painter by looking at a photograph. If you're not familiar with their work, if you've never seen them in reality, you could not tell. You could not tell a good sculptor from a bad sculptor if you've never ever seen their work before and only looking at the pictures. That's why the same way you cannot tell whether it's a good book or bad book if you only read, just an abstract. So I think, just a last comment, I think we are in danger with our mass media and propagation of all the digital printing, etc. So there is a tendency in a society to substitute maybe tedious experience of traveling overseas and going to museums with instant online browsing through a few pieces. And I'm afraid in this we could become more, our knowledge could become more encyclopedic when it comes to history of art. But what it would lack is the experience of art itself.
Can you just comment, picking up, and then Mona's going to say something on Lieba's comment. You obviously saw Jeffrey's work online before you actually saw it in situ. And can you just...
Well, within months, when I started photographing art, I stopped looking at any art books, because I realized that they only lie. So what I did when I looked at the Jeffrey's photographs online, I made a conscious effort not to pass any judgment and not to look at them at all. I waited until I actually came here. But I had, again, several decades of experience of how not to judge new pieces unknown to me by their images.
Mona and then Jeffrey.
I would just add to that I think sometimes the act of reproduction or the reproduction itself becomes the subject of inquiry. So I think it isn't, you're absolutely right that there are inherent limitations, but I think it goes a bit beyond just acknowledging them and moving on. For example, in Alistair's talk when he showed us those Moore sculptures, the way and the Smiths in particular, the way the perspective that had been chosen to elevate them above the landscape became the subject of the inquiry, and the reproduction itself becomes the object of visual study. And so I think there's many things in your talk going on simultaneously that are really very interesting. It's a tool and it's an introduction. Absolutely. I really like that, Jeffrey. That's a really helpful way for me to talk about it with my students, I think. But at the same time, it creates a whole other layer of mediation that is an art form in itself that I think we're sort of shifting back and forth between acknowledging and looking through. So treating it as a window and sometimes treating it as an object in itself, which I think is really interesting.
Yeah, I'd like to speak to something that may seem obvious, but we really haven't touched on. and that's the aspect of the ephemeral. The object of this park is to go on in perpetuity. There's a lot of work that's going into that particular aspect of it. It's one of the things that I have gotten from returning to Florence many times, is that as I've changed, my perception of the work has changed. Now, the problem with any art show is that it has an ephemeral quality itself. So the show may last 3 weeks, might last 3 months, it might even last a year, but what happens is that just the concept of experiencing work that itself is on a temporary basis, is installed on a temporary basis, whether it's a painting show or a sculpture show, does not allow for that return to that place. So one of the things that I've always gotten from Florence is to be able to return to the same place, return to the same work. And it ends up that, from my point of view, a measure of the quality of the work is whether or not it can change with me. And that's whether or not it's a piece of music or whether or not it's a piece of sculpture or a painting, as to whether or not I see it with fresh eyes. And that painting hasn't changed, that place hasn't changed, but what has changed is I've changed, and that work still works for me 5 years later, 10 years later, 20 years later, sometimes 30 years later. I've lived that long. So that's one of the aspects of what I'm trying to do with the park, is create an environment that you can return to. So anyone who's here can return to it sometime in the future, if that's what they want to do. What will happen is, if the judgment of the work in anyone's eyes who returns here in 5 years, 10 years, or 20 years will be whether or not that work works for them after that number of years. And I think that that's what really makes an outstanding work of art. And since there's no way of the artist to measure it even in his lifetime, whether or not that will happen, then the concept of the park here is to place these pieces in perpetuity. And there are a couple of parks like that have really been meaningful to me. I know that I can always go to the Rodin Sculpture Garden and see how that's changed. I know that going to Florence, I can always go to the Accademia, or I can go to the little, my favorite is the Magdalene in the Duomo Museum, just behind the Duomo. And I know I can return there, even though they've changed that museum. When I started out going there, it was a little hole in the wall. And then in the millennium, they changed it and it became glass and flashy. The piece is still there, and it's still in the same room, and I can still go back to it and still experience what I need to experience from that piece. So, yeah, we haven't touched on that, and I just thought that maybe this is something that I should say.
Yeah, good. Does anyone else want to build on that, or agree or disagree, or their own experience? Jennifer, you look like you've got something to say.
No, I don't. No,
Alistair. Sorry. Oh! Go ahead.
Too polite.
Well, one and the other.
I mean, you know what you're talking about. I'll make it up as I go.
I know what I'm talking about. Stopping time seems to be very important for you, Jeffrey. And that might be another way into these conversations about photography. A lot of the works that we've seen at the park seem to involve setting up a scenario with forms that look like they're in motion. They look like they're collapsing or bursting into the air, or they're going somewhere. And yet they've been frozen, using welding as a technique. And what welding does is it enables improbable relationships that you can't get in other situations. Cubes hang in space, and they look like they shouldn't be able to do that, but they can because of the amazing strength of this material that you're using, which is steel. And the photograph does that too. It does something very odd. Nobody sees in the way that a photograph sees. We see in time. Everything is changing all the time. The photograph stops it. The shutter. Oh, there is no shutter anymore. The pixels are touched, and that's it. And it's a very, very artificial medium. And I'd like to throw that up in the air and wonder whether we could speak to that ambition to do something which is highly artificial, to stop time.
Yes, young lad.
I'm very curious to see where virtual reality will take us in the future. Being immersed in technology is part of my youth, and I found that that the more and more push towards reproducing reality or augmenting it is one of the major trends, I guess I should say, in the last few years. I'm very curious to see where this will take us in the art world, because many of my friends say, oh, look what I made in this little game, look what I made in this little program, and say, oh, that's art. And I keep thinking to myself, this will never come close, like Sergei said, to reproducing the real thing. But my question is, how long before that line between reality and the reproduced, how long before we cannot tell the difference?
I've missed out Christopher in this. Christopher.
Okay.
Just for anyone who wants to answer.
I wasn't going to answer him.
Okay, there's a yes, gentleman at the back.
Should I do that?
Grab a mic and please identify yourself.
Thanks, Maria. Hi, I'm John Nemi from Hornby Island, and I hear you speak of time especially. And yesterday or earlier, Sergei spoke of the cup as sculpture. I think he, if I interpret correctly, he spoke of it as stuck in time, where it's a bit static. And I think we start to put too many boundaries around all these things, whether it's a photo or a good photo or not. And to me, I don't see the cup or the sculpture stuck in time at all. It's all fleeing forward with us. We like to think it's not, but it is. And yesterday, as you all spoke about creative tension, how the artist has this awesome opportunity to maybe create the ultimate piece, and yet as he or she looks backwards over her or he or she's shoulder, wondering whether commercial pressures or religious or political or even pressures put on the artist himself or herself because of their place in culture. I think you can go on and on about the pros and cons about a lot of things, but to me the ultimate message, and I hope I don't go out of context of the symposium, but to me it's almost like we are all, or humanity is searching for the mature consciousness in amongst all these things. And I don't think you can separate the artist or the scientist or the bus driver or the taxi driver or whatever. And Peter, if you don't mind, you're the one that introduced some of these ideas to us yesterday morning on behalf of Jeff. I wonder, and once again, I believe humanity is searching or is somehow striving for this mature consciousness. I know it's easy to argue that some of us are definitely not, but to me that's what brings it all together. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's heady stuff. Sergei.
Yeah, I just also a quick notion about virtual reality. I would like to clarify one point which I made earlier. If you identify yourself as your consciousness, we are not looking at reality. We are not seeing the world. We are not seeing material world. What our mind sees is a simulation in our brain. Yeah, it's been confirmed all over again with the neuroscience. And it's that what distinguishes us from animals in many ways, because we can look at two-dimensional picture and translate it into three-dimensional world and perceive it as three-dimensional world. So when we're talking about perceived shapes, perceived reality, it doesn't matter what triggers it. It could be two-dimensional object, it could be virtual reality, or it could be object in real time and space. What it has to do with is how much information this you can pass in our brain. And if you look from that point of view, nothing substitutes interaction with a real object, like sculpture. That could be only pale imitation because the channel of information is limited. And if the virtual reality goes beyond being a little toy, then it would be no different from any other reality.
I need to address this. Yeah. So this will address you, maybe address you too. The last pieces and the one that's in that photograph have all been, for the last 10 or 12 years, all been evolved from three-dimensional computer programming, virtual reality. So I use it in the evolution of the work. And these last pieces I could not do 40 years ago when I was modeling and drawing because I couldn't read what the stainless steel would look like in space. I just couldn't read it. The stainless, the way that I've used it, the way that I used the heavy steel pieces was a relationship between the thickness of the steel and the shapes themselves. What happened to me as I moved on, firstly, the computers had to catch up with what I was already capable of doing. So when I began with this, the computer programming was so bad and the computers were so slow that I couldn't use them. I couldn't match my own. I couldn't draw my own in 3 dimensions. I couldn't draw my own work. But gradually that started to happen. And I would go through maybe 3 generations of computers and software in a given year in order to bring it up to speed. Eventually, I was able to design completely in 3 dimensions. Now, this is not real 3 dimensions because the strange part about this is that it violates the basic rule of physics. You can have an object that you perceive, both of them in space at exactly the same time. It violates primary rules of physics. So that's one of the things that you have to learn. Drawing in 3 dimensions was really, really an interesting thing because I had always felt that that's what the Renaissance artists would have loved to have the ability to do. And as this began to happen, you had to count on the programming in order to give you the kind of detailing that you wanted. And what I recognized from that was that something that I had always wanted to do when I was from graduate school onward was to do intaglio prints because I loved doing intaglio prints. But I couldn't stand the mess. I couldn't stand the printers. I couldn't stand any of those particular things. And one of the reasons I stayed with this, even though the first programming was awful, is it was capable of lighting and doing really superb intaglio printing. The laser printers that I had were able to do the spectrum of grays that were necessary to do the etchings that I wanted to do, and I was able to light them. And so I could take my 3-dimensional object, put it onto several different planes, and have several different prints. So that's how I began with it. Then I used excellent paper with that. Now, what happened was that the programs would start to grow. And one of my favorite programs, it was one of the most crashable. It took me 3 months to do the drawing that I wanted to do, and it would crash, but it did superb detail.
I've seen them, they're gorgeous. They're absolutely gorgeous.
So gradually, so one had to love these drawings in order to spend that kind of time with it. It was taking longer than the pieces themselves. So gradually they would simplify the program and make it so it would crash less and detail was lost. So now I was really upset with that. So now the question of designing still went on, and it still went on as though I were making models out of matte board. There was no color. Everything was in black and white, which was nice. So it went the same way as photography. But it never solved the stainless steel issue. it eventually solved the casting issue so that I could actually model the pieces that are in the castings with all of the imagination that was there. And what I found is it actually improved the creativity because of the evolution of that work from 1989 on. I wanted to use the metaphor for the Burgess Shale. And when I did that, I had to change my view of evolution and an evolution of originality because the original view of it was vertical integration with the work, that you would move onward in time by adding more organization to the piece, and then you would eventually evolve. But what happened, what I was able to do with computer drawing was do what happens with the shale and deal with the Darwinian problem. Where are the missing fossils, the fossil record? Well, you know where it went? Delete. Mm-hmm. And so all of these other layers would go that would be rejected between one piece and another. And what I was able to do was be able to catch the horizontality in terms of evolution by moving across, because the computer allowed me. I didn't feel the ownership of those drawings. I felt like those drawings could be tossed in the garbage really easily, and that just meant hit delete. So now I have a whole series, and this series, he's showing that this piece is all computer designed. So now, it still doesn't deal with the stainless steel problem. I couldn't solve the stainless steel problem until 2004, I think, when the programs I was using would allow me to paint the pieces while I was working and work in real time with painted stainless steel, which was my own stainless steel. I photographed my stainless steel pieces, used that to paint the pieces I was working on so that I could actually see them, conceive of them in stainless steel. And this last series is totally based on that aspect, and I could not have done it without it. I just could not visualize these pieces and the limits of the stainless steel itself, which is strange to say that there are limits, but the thickness of stainless steel was fixed back to where I was in the series number 3, which was in half-inch plate.
Yeah.
So now, in order to get the volumes that I wanted and the relationships that I needed, I had to be able to visualize this in 3 dimensions. So when you say, well, how do you realize eventually in virtual reality, these pieces were created and are part of virtual reality. Mm-hmm. That's how they manifest themselves. Outside of the computer, they're actually manifest.
Because, yeah, for me, just relating this, for instance, to music, I found that there is a limit to what can be described on a page versus what is played in real life. Mm-hmm. And I find that there are 2 kinds of music for me. I mean, this is just an opinion. I'm not proposing this as a fact or anything. But for me, it is that written music is a different kind of music than what is played with a band or with other musicians. Because with other musicians, you have a true conversation, but with written music, it's pre-thought, to use a term that I don't really understand very well. It's a conversation that is pre-written, I should say. And with programming, I feel that you're crossing domains, just like taking a picture of a 3-dimensional, just like removing a dimension with photography by taking a 2-dimensional picture of a 3-dimensional object. You're crossing domains, and I think that there's always something you'll be losing by doing that. And just like writing a piece of music down versus playing it, it always brings a sense of, you always have a sense of failure. Anybody wish to add?
Maybe, Sergei, you'd like to address that, and since we're now, thank you, we're now moving towards the end, and
Maria,
we do have time for a couple of more comments. But I just wanted to say to Sergei, as Christopher Butterfield showed us his work, do you have one of your art, the photograph of Red Square, which everyone, it's a famous
I would not dare to show my art here, in Jeffrey's presence and in his
No,
park.
but you could pull up the red square one.
Everybody can see it later on.
But everyone will know it.
Yeah.
They'll recognize it
they
right
will
away.
recognize it.
Yeah.
But what I would like to, just since we have any time, is I would like to make a few comments about new emerging different ways of reproducing media. Because it was early on recognized that the sculpture is three-dimensional objects. So how can we reproduce three-dimensional objects? Stereophotography came pretty much the day after the photography was invented. And now we all have 3D movies with 3D glasses. It's a complete disaster because, again, our brains process so much information. So when you present our brain with a stereoscopic vision, but you focus it right in front of your eye, it looks like a dollhouse. I've seen the goggles where you look at virtual reality, which focuses actually on a distance. However, still does not fool our brain, because you know what we do? When you present it in a virtual reality, you immediately start shaking your head and to see if the image moving. And the moment our brain subconsciously realizes that the image is not moving when I move my head, the brain knows it's a phony. The next one is holograms. Again, there was a great expectations about it, but the virtue of the hologram is such so it's limited in size. And what has been done so far is probably would work for a couple of coins and a small miniatures. So again, there is no hope there. The next one is quite interesting. They're called moving stills. It's where you take a video instead of a photograph when the camera pans. In the movies, they use it all the time to show the space by moving the camera. But obviously people thought about using it to photograph sculpture. So you move the camera around or just a little bit, and that's supposed to help our brain to recognize that three-dimensional object. Again, it's a complete failure because, yes, you recognize it as a three-dimensional object, but you cannot experience it as an object of art because this movement is imposed on you. You have no control over it. To me, experiencing three-dimensional art is the ability to subconsciously move and interact with the visual form. So it's as if somebody puts you in a wheelchair and wheels you through museums. At the same time, they tape your eyes so you can only look where they point you. What kind of an art experience is this? So I'm afraid, still, as far as I can see, there is no substitution for experience art in reality.
Peter, and then Alan, would you like to make a comment? Because this is all about light and changing and... Yeah. Peter, okay.
Well, can I take up Sergei on this ground? When he spoke about an hour ago and said that the photograph was always going to be totally inferior and totally different from the reality of sculpture because you're translating 3 dimensions into 2 dimensions, I nodded along with Sergei, but the more I think about it, the more I think this is too hard and fast. It's not completely false, but it's not completely true either, because after all, our brains are clever. We only see in 3 dimensions when we have both eyes open, but you try it. If you shut one eye, you don't immediately flash into 2 dimensions. Your brain is compensating. The brain knows what images it's taking in. You see with one eye more or less what you see with 2 eyes. And the same thing, it seems to me, applies to us when we are looking at a photograph which we know perfectly well is in 2 dimensions, but because we know that a 2-dimensional photograph of sculpture is in 3 dimensions, I think we are compensating for that in our brains, and we're seeing, therefore, much more than it seems to me you are acknowledging.
Well, actually, I was acknowledging it. I was saying that is the problem which cannot be solved, but could be mitigated.
Yeah.
As long as...
Yeah. Alistair, you're grinning away.
It's true, I'm grinning away.
I could say...
Alan, you know, because you come from such a different perspective
Maria,
on
I
all
could
this,
say
and yet you
something
deal
about
with light.
In the theater, oftentimes the lighting designer's job is to throw light upon the actor or the scenic environment. But there are times where the light itself becomes the three-dimensional subject on the stage. But to do that, we have to make the air more dense so that the light has something to catch in space. And that's the point where light itself becomes the sculptural medium. And we see that most often in concerts, in fact, or in the dance world. More and more, directors seem to be interested in deploying this sort of device so the light becomes a three-dimensional character on the stage, in a way like another one of the human characters on the stage. So it's an interesting line to walk. Yeah, at times the light really serves to illuminate the body, and in doing so, it's a sculptural tool in the revelation of the three-dimensional form of the human body. Whereas at other times, the light itself becomes a three-dimensional medium. So there's, there are trends and fads in the theater, I guess, like there are in all disciplines. But we see increasingly the use of light as the three-dimensional sculptural medium itself.
I can just add that, just for future reference, the most well-known version of these goggles that Sergei mentioned are called the Oculus Rift, if anyone wishes to look it up or have future, or further knowledge, I should say. That's all.
I can agree with Sergei to a certain degree. There's this is a legal precedent. When earlier I was talking about that I can decipher these images, and I agree with Peter to a certain degree that if you're trained at looking at art images, you can interpret. But the average person is not able to do that. And I'll give you the example is Jeff Koons' String of Puppies. He based it on a postcard that he got at the airport, and it was based the postcards of a photograph of a couple holding 12 puppies together. And Jeff Koons made a three-dimensional sculpture based on this photograph. And then subsequently, when the piece became much more famous and was selling for much more money, the photographer decided to sue Jeff Koons. And everyone thought it was absolutely ridiculous. Koons thought it was ridiculous. The lawyers thought it was ridiculous. Because this thing was a three-dimensional sculpture. It was life-size, and the puppies were blue. It was in full color. The original photograph was in black and white. However, during the court, because they thought that they had such a good chance of winning, they didn't bother bringing the sculpture in. They brought in a photograph of the sculpture, and they lost the court case.
Well, on that, Marcus. Marcus, would you like the last word? Because I'm going to expire.
Last word sounds very final. I was just thinking. It's remarkable and it's shocking how little time we actually tend to spend in front of art objects. There have been surveys of things like the National Gallery where they found that it was actually an average of 12 seconds in front of each piece. And the thing is that going around the sculpture park, there were certainly ones where we stopped and we talked, and there were other ones we walked past and we had momentary reflections on them. And so the thing is that there's the element of time and the difference between perhaps actually sitting down with an art book several days in a row for long periods of time, and then the relatively fleeting experience sometimes we get of objects when we're off doing research for a variety of reasons. Yeah, indeed. And so the thing is that actually a lot of our perception of objects, art objects, is our memory. And so the thing is that I think, we talk about we talk about this sort of idea of this moment of being there, but actually much of our processing and our real experience of it is after the fact.
Yes, that's absolutely right. And sometimes it's very difficult to experience when people have cameras in front of you taking photographs. They don't look at the work, they just photograph it and move on, and it drives me nuts. Yes. The final word.
Sorry, I don't want to steal Marcus's thunder, because I've been thinking about this for about the last hour now and trying to figure out how to say it. I've had a problem being here. Not that it's not wonderful to be here, but I realized all of a sudden that what I've been dealing with is a form of chaos, and that chaos has to do with a scale of both space and time. I have not had the time to assimilate everything that I see. I haven't had, nor can I comprehend, I guess, the way that I am expected to look at certain objects and then fit them in with the larger experience generally. So I'm stuck now as I take the ferry home again with a sense of the ineffable that comes out of chaos, but a chaos of scale, which is something that I talk to my students a great deal about, because there's no such thing as chaos. There's only order you haven't perceived yet. Right? So, and this fits a little bit, I think, with Marcus's view as well. All I've got to go on right now is my memory until a return, which happens really in the experience of any artwork. And yes, I have the aide-memoire of the photograph. I have the aide-memoire of the recording, because that's all a recording can be, right? So all I have until I come back, and have tried to figure out how that experience of time and space works is my memory to do that.
Well, I'm sure we all agree. Thanks for the memory, Jeff.
No, that's true. Well, thank you, Sergei, and thank all of you for your comments. And I think we're now going to have our closing remarks, aren't we?
Oh.
That's next on our list.
Well, I turned it over to you to introduce it.
Oh, I was turning over to you.
Okay.
No, I will introduce it. May I say the last couple of days have been fantastic, and I hope you've enjoyed looking at the work as much as I have. And I'm going to go out there after lunch and have another look. And I know some of you will be doing the same thing. We've covered a lot of ground. We've opened up so many topics, like being an art critic or an art historian or a journalist. There's so many avenues that we could have explored, and I probably cut a lot of people off, and you didn't get a chance to explore it. But it certainly stimulated me in my thinking about art criticism, sculpture in particular. And I hope that you have had the same experience. And again, thanks to Betty Kennedy and Jeffrey Rubinoff for their generosity, and Karun for being the most fabulous organizer in the world.
What made this forum more unusual for us was the proximity that we have to Victoria. So there are a few people who have come a very long way. That's more often the case than not. It's here. We're not going anywhere. So when we talk about the memory or the glimpse, this is one of the objects of dealing with UVic, was to introduce people to the work, introduce them to the park, and do feel that it's accessible. It's here. We're going to be open several times during the summertime. And so really, this can't be any more than that glimpse, that introduction. So I would hope that you all feel welcome on coming back. This is part of the purpose of doing this.
On that note, I think we can have lunch. Thank you.